Good evening. I'm David Feldman. I'm the director of the Pears Institute for the Study of Antisemitism, which is located just next door at Birkbeck. And I'm extremely pleased to welcome you all to this Pears Wiener lecture, especially pleased because it's the first in our series of lectures which we've been able to hold in the Wiener Library's fantastic new premises here, and it sort of takes the sort of and both it's a wonderful space, but it also takes the partnership between the Institute and the Wiener Library to a new stage, which is important and pleasing. The lecture series is subtitled Archives, Artefacts and Interpreting the Past, which is a bit of a mouthful, but at least now we're in the Wiener Library, it's a mouthful with a purpose. And at the back of the room is indeed an artifact from Captain Ramsey's Right Club, and you will hear more about the importance and significance of this artifact in the course of the lecture this evening. And it is my sort of last and extremely pleasurable task to introduce our lecturer, who is, unless you've turned up in the wrong place, you will already know, is Professor Geoffrey Alderman from the University of Buckingham. Geoffrey has written more books than a whole collection of historians would normally aspire to write in their entire career. Perhaps most significantly, he's written Modern British Jewry, which has now been published by Oxford University Press in 2 editions, a work which is absolutely indispensable for anyone who wants to understand the past and indeed the present of Jewish history in this country. But I think I want to underline the sort of breadth and range of Geoffrey's writings, not only on Jewish history, but also on electoral politics and on interest groups as well. His first book was on the railway interest, and it is entirely appropriate that he asked me to let you know that he is indeed a trainee steam locomotive driver. But this evening, he's going to be talking to us on Defending the Indefensible, Reflections on the Anglo-Jewish Reaction to Domestic Antisemitism, 1931 to 1940. Geoffrey.
Thank you very much. Between 1931 and 1940, the Jewish communities of the British Isles were compelled, or at least David felt themselves compelled, to formulate and implement a coherent communities-wide defence policy. This was something that had never before been attempted. It is true that in earlier epochs, various defence stratagems had been deployed to meet situations as they arose. During the struggle for emancipation between, say, 1830 and 1860, a number of steps had been taken by individuals and in a largely uncoordinated way to defend British Jewry from its detractors. For example, moneyed Jews were persuaded to fund schemes of apprenticeship to wean Jewish youngsters away from the attractions of a life of crime, for it was well known and understood that although Fagin was a fictional villain, there were numerous examples of real Jews and Jewesses involved in the receiving and disposing of stolen property. I'm not a Dickens scholar. The Dickens scholarly fraternity has interesting arguments about who Fagin was based on, but we know that Dickens himself was aware of a number of cases particularly a man called Litzenberg and another one, Ike Solomons, both of whom stood trial for running gangs of juveniles, thieves and supplying boys. Do you understand that? So we know that. And the Jewish community at the time was extremely sensitive on this point. Indeed, so great was the fear of the opprobrium that this activity, centred on Petticoat Lane, Middlesex Street, in London, might bring down upon the entirety of British Jewry, that during the 1850s, it was seriously suggested within the Anglo-Jewish aristocracy that the lessees of this hive of criminal activity should be bought out and the market itself closed down. A half-century later, in a desperate attempt to prevent the posthumous publication of Captain Sir Richard Burton's scurrilous treatise entitled Human Sacrifice Amongst the Sephardim, curious word, or Eastern Jews, the Board of Deputies did actually purchase the manuscript to thus ensure its suppression. And if I may make a plug here, Professor Colin Holmes of Sheffield University and I have written about the history of this manuscript, an article published by the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society some 4 years ago, just under 4 years ago. These examples might indeed be termed defence stratagems, but they were hardly defence policies. Rather, they had been concocted upon the spur of the moment to deal with situations as they arose. They were entirely reactive and in no genuine sense proactive, and they were informed overwhelmingly by the abiding Anglo-Jewish obsession, which is, of course, the obsession with communal image. Neither the Board of Deputies, nor the United Synagogue, nor the Chief Rabbinate opposed what became the Aliens Act of 1905, designed, however inadequately, to keep Jews out of the United Kingdom. And we might also note that during and immediately after the First World War, faced with nationwide anti-alien sentiments, these bodies did little, if anything, to oppose, for example, the blatant and unashamed anti-Jewish prejudice that lay behind new regulations promulgated by the London County Council with the aim of restricting Jewish access to council housing, council scholarships, and council employment. Virtually, I won't say nothing, but almost nothing was done. Asked at a meeting of the deputies in March 1925 to justify such inertia, the Conservative MP and LCC member Sir Isidore Salmon, a treasurer of the United Synagogue, explained that given the temper of the times, it was simply not prudent for the board to make a nuisance of itself by campaigning against LCC policy, while another speaker, Robert Henriques, and I quote, pointed out how necessary it was to exercise tact in cases like this. These were difficult times, he said, and there was much prejudice abroad, unquote. But in the following decade, this policy of inactivity changed. It had to. To begin with, the advent of a Nazi government in Germany in 1933, its media, its well-oiled and media-savvy PR machine pouring out across Europe. We have many, many examples in the Wiener Library. Where else? The vilest anti-Jewish venom, this could simply not be ignored. The following year, 1934, the British Union of Fascists officially adopted anti-Semitism as a central plank in its political platform. When, in 1932, Oswald Mosley transformed his new party into the BUF, he affected to assure British Jewry that anti-Semitism formed, quote, no part, unquote, of its policy. For a moment, the Board of Deputies and even the Jewish Chronicle accepted that this was so. And it was well known, we have the Red Book here, that certain leading members of the Anglo-Jewish communities of the British Isles, including Sir Philip Magnus, Gladstone's biographer, and the barrister Lionel Leonard Cohen, later Lord Cohen of Walmer, who was chairman of the Law and Parliamentary Commission of the Board of Deputies, were BUF sympathisers. They were members of a club known as the January Club, because it was formed in January 1934 by the deputy leader of the BUF, the ex-ILP MP Dr. Robert Forgan. At Mosley's insistence, the January Club was a halfway house for those people, not just or even primarily Jews, who wanted to support the BUF but didn't want actually to go carry around BUF membership cards. So you could belong to the January Club, you would support the BUF. And we know that Philip Magnus, Lionel Leonard Cohen and other prominent Jews were members of the January Club. But in October 19th, and of course Mosley's own bodyguard was Ted Kid Lewis, an East End Jewish boxer. But in October 1934, Mosley opted for an explicit anti-Jewish discourse, which rapidly became ever more prominent in BUF propaganda, culminating in the attempted provocative march through London's East End, which culminating in the so-called Battle of Cable Street on the 4th of October 1936, and the orgy of reprisals against Jewish property, which was carried out at Mile End and elsewhere in the East End the following week. Jews had already been refused membership of the BUF, and the few Jews who had managed to enrol themselves in it, not just in the January Club, but actually in the BUF, including Ted Kid Lewis, the Jewish boxer, were frozen out. I shall return to Cable Street, whose 75th anniversary we have just commemorated, in due course. Here I want to consider the wider picture, by which I mean primarily the wider mosaic of homegrown anti-Jewish prejudice, off of which fed not only the BUF, but also, and dare I say, more respectable political parties. While there is no way in which we can measure, so to speak, the volume or extent of anti-Jewish prejudice in Britain at this time, there are no opinion polls or social surveys of a scientific or quasi-scientific course that we can point to, there is little doubt in my mind that such prejudice was widespread. The pioneering mass observation surveys, incidentally, did inter alia probe Jewish attitudes, but they were only launched in 1939. By this I mean that it was by no means confined, anti-Semitism was by no means confined to what one might term street anti-Semitism that had been and was continued to be, and in some respects still is, a feature of British urban existence. An indeterminate but very real level of middle and upper class prejudice against Jews was also taken for granted. This might manifest itself at public schools or golf clubs or even in the admissions policies of medical schools. The Conservative Party provided a safe haven for out-and-out anti-Semites, not only Captain Ramsay, but also Edward Doran, MP for Tottenham, 1931 to 35. In June 1937, the Jewish mayor of Cheltenham, Daniel Lipson, who taught at Cheltenham Ladies' College, won the Cheltenham by-election as an independent after the local Conservative Association had succumbed to an insidious, behind-the-curtains parlour campaign, anti-Jewish campaign, and had refused to adopt him. It's ironic that the only Jewish Conservative MP elected in 1945 was the independent Daniel Lipson. We know now that the success and popularity of the British Union of Fascists was destined not to last. But hindsight is the worst enemy of the historian. This could not have been known at the time of Cable Street, Indeed, at the LCC elections of March 1937, BUF candidates polled a very respectable 14% of the votes in Shoreditch, 19% in Limehouse, and 23% in Bethnal Green. And we know that Moseley had plans. Of course, there ought to have been an election in 1940, but it was postponed. But Moseley had plans, had war not broken out, to fight the election of 1940 on a wide electoral front. Had a general election been held there, it would have been a safe bet to have wagered that certainly Moseley himself and other prominent BUF members would have put up, and who knows how many deposits would have been saved. Moseley was certainly not stopped, ladies and gentlemen, at Cable Street, about which there still exist a great many myths. In the early 1990s, I had the privilege of supervising a brilliant doctoral student, Thomas Linehan, now of Brunel University, who had taken upon himself the daunting task of recreating the membership lists of the East London and South West Essex branches of the BUF, and from those lists of discovering who the members of these branches were and why they joined the BUF. When the BUF was proscribed in 1940, most of its membership records were deliberately destroyed. Historians who in the 1960s and 70s first started seriously examining the phenomenon of the BUF had relied almost exclusively on what were at best intelligent guesses as to the total BUF and individual branch membership. Dr. Linehan swept all these generalisations aside. Through painstaking detective work, worldwide I should add, he was able to provide us with our first accurate insight into the periodic rise and fall of BUF membership, which was, as it turned out, tied very much to local politics and local circumstances. His thesis was published in 1996 as East London for Moseley. On page 202 of that book, you will find an extraordinary analysis of the impact of the so-called Battle of Cable Street on BUF recruitment. The Battle of Cable Street took place on Sunday, the 4th of October 1936. To celebrate the 4th anniversary of the establishment of the BUF, Moseley announced that the massed ranks of the party would assemble for inspection at the Royal Mint and then march through East London for a rally at Victoria Park. The BUF was fully entitled to hold such an event under the then existing law. Nor would this have been the first time the BUF had marched through East London. There had been previous marches without serious incident. But an alliance of left-wing groups, led by the Communist Party, decided to pick a fight with the BUF in order to heighten awareness of the fascist threat and to engineer a situation in which, as they hoped, the BUF would be banned or its activities severely restricted. The Spanish Civil War had broken out 3 months earlier, and British communists and their fellow travellers were going to show at Cable Street that they too could fight fascism. Or, as one of them confessed at a seminar I chaired at London University's Institute of Historical Research in 1986, at which we brought together Cable Street veterans from all sides. David, it was a very long table. At one end we had veterans of the BUF, at the other veterans of the anti-BUF movement, in the middle 3 policemen who had been present. It was a fantastic seminar. So one of these communists said that they were going to show that physically confronting the BUF, he said, was going to make us feel good. We were going to feel good by physically confronting the BUF. And so, in order that a motley collection of left-wingers, many of them Jews, of course, could feel good, the civil rights of the BUF were going to be swept aside. The police were out in force to protect these rights, and the battle that took place was not, as it turned out, between the anti-fascists and the BUF, but between the anti-fascists and the police. That was what the Battle of Cable Street was really about. Moseley and his followers were indeed prevented from marching to Victoria Park but they reaped a rich reward. It is owing to the research of Dr. Linehan that we now have an authoritative account of the effect of Cable Street on BUF popularity. There was, concludes Dr. Linehan, a spectacular leap in BUF recruitment in East London following the events of Cable Street. The membership of the BUF rose steadily to a peak of around 40,000 in 1937, and it was this swelling of the ranks that formed the basis of its support, to which I've just referred, at the LCC elections that year. Why did upright tradesmen and shopkeepers, and even professional people, support and join the BUF? Why was there so much hostility to Jews, both in London's East End and in other cities, such as Leeds and Manchester and Liverpool? Liverpool had a very active BUF branch. These questions obsessed the Board of Deputies, which had urged Jews to stay away from Cable Street, and with good reason. 10 days after the battle, the board's president, the barrister Neville Lasky, had a secret meeting with the communist leader Harry Pollitt and the Labour MP Herbert Morrison. Both agreed that Jews carried much of the responsibility for the prejudice against them. The apparent success of the BUF in the mid-1930s seemed to suggest that the popular anti-Semitism of the streets had at last found an articulate and well-financed middle-class leadership prepared to exploit social and economic grievances in order to whip up anti-Jewish feeling, which was itself then used as a major vehicle in its quest for political advancement. The Board of Deputies was initially not well equipped to counterattack. A suggestion from Sir Robert Whaley-Cohen, a vice president both of the board and of the United Synagogue, that a defence committee be established, was vetoed by Neville Lasky, the president, on the grounds that such a move would create panic. Instead, the Law and Parliamentary and Information and Press and Information committees of the board were linked by a coordinating committee. What you do in Anglo Jewry, you form a committee. That's the problem with Anglo Jewry. It's easy to form committees, damn difficult to get rid of them afterwards. This agreement was intrinsically defective and could not last. In November 1938, the coordinating committee became the Defence Committee, with a full-time secretary of its own, Sidney Salomon, a lawyer and son of a Manchester rabbi who had worked on the Jewish Chronicle and later in the London office of the Yorkshire Post. At about the same time, Lasky became, in effect, the board's first full-time president. Money raised secretly by Whaley-Cohen enabled him to give up his own legal career, which in any case was on the sticks at that time because of his alcoholism, in order to concentrate on Jewish defence. By the outbreak of war, communal defence had assumed its place as the greatest of the board's priorities, and so, David, it has remained. But in fact, the board operated and has continued to operate two distinct and in truth conflicting defence strategies. The first was aimed naturally at the detractors of British Jewry. A typescript memo by Salomon, now in the Neville Lasky papers in the University of Southampton, tells us that this strategy included intelligence gathering, media monitoring and cooperation with the special branch. At times of municipal and national elections, for example, the 1937 local elections, the North East Leeds and Middleton and Prestwich by-elections of 1940, candidates in the major political parties were offered election literature which they could then distribute. In this way, the board hoped to encourage an anti-fascist vote. There was, in fact, a continuous programme of publications and lectures on anti-fascist themes, but emphasising also the Jewish contribution to British life. In 1938, Salomon published The Jews of Britain, in which he played down the Jewish contribution, the Jewish involvement in finance and commerce, but stressed instead the Jewish contribution to the arts and medicine. An agreement, again referred to by Salomon in his memo, was reached with the British Broadcasting Corporation, which undertook to submit to the board the scripts of any programme of Jewish interest and to abide by the board's decision or to further discussion on the matter. Extraordinary agreement between the BBC and the Board of Deputies, which Salomon was responsible for. In November 1940, the chairman of the Defence Committee, Gordon Liverman, reached an agreement with Maurice Meyer, by which in return for a loan from the committee of £500, not inconsiderable sum in those days, an unqualified assurance not to allow his Yiddish pro-Zionist paper Die Zeit was given to advocate a contrary attitude to the official policy of the board. So in fact, Maurice Meyer, the editor of this quite popular Yiddish newspaper Die Zeit, the editor took a bribe from the Board of Deputies and gave them control, in effect a veto, over his editorial policy. Much of the board's defence literature, by reason of its diffidence and condescension, arguably strengthened the anti-Semitic cause. Nor in any case did all this commendable effort represent the major thrust of the defence policy, which was aimed not so much at protecting Jews from their detractors as at shielding the detractors from the Jews. And I would argue that the major thrust of board defence policy in the 1930s was to defend non-Jews from Jews. In the aftermath of Cable Street, as I've already alluded to, Neville Lasky arranged, through his brother Harold, then a professor at the London School of Economics, a member of the executive of the Fabian Society and a rising star on the left of the Labour Party. So Neville made contact with his brother, who had married out, the tale of two brothers. Neville made contact with his brother Harold, and Harold arranged a secret meeting with Harry Pollitt and Herbert Morrison, who had, of course, masterminded Labour's capture of the LCC in 1934 and was now Labour leader at County Hall. Neville Lasky wished to discuss with these two very experienced observers of and participants in the politics of working class London, Pollitt and Morrison, why there was such hostility to Jews. The record of this meeting is contained in a typescript note, now in the Neville Lasky papers, of the meeting. This typescript note was made by Neville and dated the 14th of October 1936. In view of its less than flattering portrayal of Morrison and Pollitt, some observers have cast doubt on its authenticity, but there is in fact absolutely nothing to suggest that Neville was other than scrupulously honest in what he recorded. Remember, ladies and gentlemen, this was a memorandum not made for publication. It was a secret memorandum only shown to the Executive and the Defence Committee of the Board. What Neville recorded was that Morrison and Pollitt made some very unflattering remarks about Barnett Janner's invocation of the Jewish vote at Whitechapel during the emotion-charged by-election there in 1930, when Barney Janner, then a Liberal, played the Zionist card. And I quote from Lasky's memo. "It was well remembered," Lasky noted, and talked about, and it was said that Jews were Jews first and Englishmen a long way after, unquote. Of course, I wrote this before the interesting events of just over a couple of weeks ago, when a present Labour member of Parliament made almost identical remarks, but I don't want to be controversial about that. But the major burden of the analysis, plus ça change, but the major burden of the analysis which Lasky was offered by Pollitt and Morrison was that by their professional conduct, Jewish landlords, estate agents and businessmen had contributed much to anti-Jewish feeling in East London. Lasky did not waste much time in accepting the truth of what he had been told, and his view was shared by many other communal leaders. I've recently been reading Bill Williams' latest book, excellent survey of the reception of Central European refugees in Manchester. And in fact, Bill has some delicious quotes, I think one from the Braybrith Lodge in Manchester, that mouthing the same thing, that the Jews cause anti-Semitism. Of course, the Laskys were, old man Nathan Lasky, the father of both Neville and Harold, was the lay leader, the doyen of Manchester Jewry. During the early 1930s, the fact is that the Board of Deputies had had to deal with a number of issues of extreme sensitivity arising from the business practices of Jews, preeminently, but certainly not exclusively, in London. The board could have declined to address such matters and could have argued that what was at issue was business conduct, not Jewish business conduct. This was precisely the attitude adopted by left-wing propagandists, many of whom were also Jews. But the members and leadership of the board did not take this view. They did not take this view, partly because they were heirs to a long-standing tradition of Jewish collective responsibility for the conduct of individual Jews. Now, mind you, David, there's never been any Jewish collective responsibility for my own conduct, but we can discuss that separately. But partly also because the fascist campaigns had come to concentrate forcefully on the activities of Jewish employers, Jewish shopkeepers, Jewish landlords, and even of Jewish members of the London County Council. These attacks seemed to demand a specific Jewish response, for there could be no doubt, ladies and gentlemen, there could be no doubt that the BUF was managing to exploit these grievances, which, whether justified or not, were genuinely held against Jews and the Jewish community of London. BUF-inspired propaganda would at first sight seem a most unlikely source, indeed the most unlikely source, from which to gain a truthful insight into the roots of anti-Jewish prejudice at this time. But as a historian, I must take the view that simply because an accusation against Jews was made in the pages of a black shirt newspaper, or through the lurid typeface of a black shirt poster, does not mean that the accusation was necessarily untrue. I have to treat the accusation at face value and explore it. Consider, for example, the twin accusations made frequently in the interwar period that Jews were hostile to trade unions, yes, hostile to trade unions, and were instrumental in breaking strikes. The hostility of some Jewish employers towards trade unionism in London was certainly a major cause of ill feeling. Professor Lord Skidelsky, Bob Skidelsky, has noted that many of the BUF's most prominent activists came from the furniture trade, where intense competition led to anti-union practices. Black shirt propaganda drew attention to the paralysis affecting the unions in the furnishing trades, which was attributed to the fact, and I quote from a fascist newspaper, that Jewish bosses employ outside labour whenever workers protest, unquote. Was that accusation true? To some extent, it was disingenuous, because we know that Jewish workers were heavily involved in the National Amalgamated Furnishing Trades Association, the East London branch of which was virtually a Jewish branch, noted especially for its militancy. Nonetheless, what was alleged by the BUF was basically true. In July 1936, the Board of Deputies itself felt constrained to complain to a Jewish proprietor about the physical harassment of the National Amalgamated Furnishing Trades Association members at his factory in Tottenham. The following February, Neville Lasky, in his official capacity as President of the Board of Deputies, had to receive a complaint from the President, who happened to be a clergyman, of the Hackney Wick Workers' Club and Institute, to the effect that the Jewish Board of Guardians in London had been supplying blackleg labour to a Jewish-owned firm intent on resisting the organisation of a trade union within the company. Later that year, other communications were received by Lasky from equally reputable sources alleging anti-union stratagems by other Jewish-owned furniture and upholstery firms operating in North London. Now, in relation to such complaints, which could equally well have been made against non-Jewish firms, of course, there was little that the board officials could do. We know that the board used its influence with some of the large Jewish-owned retail hire purchase furniture stores, pay on the never never, forget your three-piece suite, to persuade them to compel factory owners to adopt a more generous wages policy and to recognise and afford rights of collective bargaining to appropriate trade unions. But the growth of anti-Semitism within the trade union movement remained a major source of communal concern, so much so that in November 1939 the board's defence committee authorised an investigation of this phenomenon. Complaints against Jewish shopkeepers were of several kinds. The greatest friction arose over the vexed question of Sunday trading. Jews widespread in eastern North London ignored the hairdressers and barbers' shops Sunday closing act of 1930 and a much more stringent and wide-ranging act of 1936. Jews sold themselves to Gentile companies so that at midnight on a Saturday evening, the company would pass into Jewish ownership, and then at midnight on the Sunday, back into non-Jewish ownership. Thus, under the 1936 Sunday Trading Registration Act, permitting the shops to be open 7 days a week. And whatever you think, ladies and gentlemen, of the Sunday trading laws, this was a matter of deep concern and deep revulsion in London and in Manchester and in Leeds. Abuses of the Sunday trading laws were so widespread that in December 1934, Neville Lasky, Barney Janner and Dr. Bernard Homer, a member of the Public Control Committee of the London County Council, but also a lay leader of the Orthodox Jewish communities in North London, summoned a meeting of Jewish traders to try and put a stop to these abuses. By 1935, the problem had become so widespread that Jews were portrayed as a particular class of offender against the Christian values of British society. But beyond the special case of Sunday trading, Jewish shopkeepers were subjected to increasing criticism on account of aggressive and innovative sales and marketing techniques for which the generality of non-Jewish retailers was ill-prepared and which they did not like. And here, of course, we come across a very interesting phenomenon of Jewish shopkeepers and traders obeying the law, the letter of the law, but nonetheless causing widespread revulsion. For example, the exploitation of loss leaders, selling some items below cost price in order to attract customers into your shop. This was felt to be unchristian. The employment of eye-catching advertising gimmicks, the abandonment of prices fixed by manufacturers, resale price maintenance. These were projected in both the trade union and fascist press as stereotypical aspects of an unacceptable face of capitalism which Jews were said explicitly or implicitly to embody. Neville Lasky was also of this view. Addressing a Cardiff audience in October 1933, he blamed Jews who, quote, and I quote him, by their own conduct fostered anti-Semitism, unquote. The diagnosis was one at which other communal leaders were also to arrive. In May 1937, for example, Louis Rabinovitz, the much respected rabbi of the Cricklewood Synagogue, informed Lasky in a letter that's in the Board of Deputies archives, and I quote the letter, that the disgraceful attitude of Jewish traders towards the 1936 Sunday trading legislation forms, in my opinion, an unanswerable argument in favour of fascist allegations, unquote. This is the on-the-record view of the rabbi of what was then one of the most prestigious constituents of the United Synagogue. This theme was one to which Lasky was to return again and again and again and again during his presidency of the board. That it amounted to an exhortation to his fellow Jews to accept, at least temporarily, a second-class status was a price he was fully prepared to pay in order to dampen anti-Jewish prejudice. At the St John's Wood United Synagogue in May 1939, Lasky condemned, and I quote him, the price-cutting activities of some Jewish traders in the tobacco, grocery, cosmetic and chemistry, he means pharmacy, businesses. I'm still quoting him. It was no use replying to these charges by saying that there were non-Jewish price cutters. He knew they were, but Jews must not trade in this way, unquote. This policy extended naturally into the housing question, to which there were two aspects. Firstly, the old allegation that Jewish households displaced Gentile families. This was resurrected as Jews moved into Bethnal Green, Stoke Newington and Hackney, which Hackney, believe it or not, in the 1930s was a desirable suburb in which to live. I was knifed there in the 1970s, but that's another story. More than that, this prejudice allegation began to acquire some uncomfortable religious overtones. In Hackney, the changing ratio of Jews to Christians resulted naturally in falling church attendances and inevitably eroded church incomes. So the charge was now not only that Jews profaned the Christian Sabbath by trading on Sundays, but they were actually undermining the Christian basis of local society. Secondly, the conduct of Jewish householders and landlords gave additional cause for concern. To the oft-heard charge that Jews were unscrupulous and rapacious landlords, a new one was added. Jewish householders were accused, often rightly, of using their residential dwellings for non-residential purposes as workshops or small factories. What had happened in Stepney and Shoreditch, it was argued, would happen in Stoke Newington and Stamford Hill. I quote from the Hackney Gazette of 1934, "Our best residential roads are being ruined by these pests," unquote. Because good private houses, unquote, were being turned to industrial purposes. And this was an accusation which inevitably the BUF exploited, particularly during the 1937 local elections. BUF speakers were instructed to stress and support the feeling which was known to be widespread, that when Jews moved into an area, respected dwellings were transformed into what Sir John Pedder, the permanent Undersecretary at the Home Office, referred to as, quote, poor, unhygienic workshops, unquote. In 1923, the London County Council, then under municipal reform, i.e. Conservative control, had adopted new housing regulations which, other than in cases of slum clearance, gave preference in the allocation of its housing stock to those who were British-born or naturalised. As new LCC housing estates were brought into commission after the First World War, the severity of this anti-alien policy became all too real. During the Home Secretaryship of William Joynson Hicks between 1924 and 29, it became very, very difficult for Jews to become naturalised. So they were hit by this housing regulation. In the borough of Stepney, by the early 1930s, the non-naturalised Jewish population amounted to 30,000 out of a total population of some 219,000. As a result, the Aliens Committee of the Board of Deputies began to interest itself in the impact and legality of the London County Council's housing policy. But under pressure from Neville Lasky and his associates on the board, this agitation was killed off. In fact, astonishing though it may seem, this discriminatory housing regulation remained on the LCC statute book, so to speak, until well after the Second World War. In 1948, a deputation from the Board of Deputies met with the then deputy leader of the London County Council, Victor Mishcon, and asked him to use his influence to repeal this regulation which was hitting non-naturalised Jews. Victor Mishcon refused. The Board of Deputies had already made clear its abhorrence of direct action in relation to the British Union of Fascists. It argued that street confrontations with fascists merely served to give them publicity and resulted in situations in which the BUF could legitimately argue that Jews sought to protect themselves by denying freedom of speech to others. What happened at Cable Street was heavily exploited by the BUF. We have the freedom of speech as true Englishmen. The Jews are denying us this freedom. Neville Lasky accepted the need for a defence committee. He accepted the need for a defence committee. But in the context of a more systematic effort by the board to police Anglo Jewry. In May 1938, a subcommittee set up at his suggestion to deal with such social conditions as sweatshops, bad employers, landlords, and price cutting in the East End, recommended the establishment of a special committee charged with the duty of enhancing communal awareness of the effect upon the communal image of what Lasky termed were individual malpractices. This is what the man whom Lasky appointed to head that defence committee, Gordon Liverman, wrote in September 1938. And I quote him from the board's records. "The time has passed for us to pretend that we are a perfect community and to ignore the fact that not a day goes by without anti-Semitism being created by Jews themselves. A new generation of unethical Jewish traders are, by bankruptcy, due to complete irresponsibility and lack of principle, causing hardship over a wide field and manufacturing anti-Semitism at high pressure," unquote. In 1914, an advisory committee to the Defence Committee was reorganised as the Trades Advisory Council. The self-defined remit of the Trades Advisory Council was, and I quote, "the elimination of friction between Jews and non-Jews in trade and industry." The deeper significance of its formal inauguration was not commented upon at the time, and has, I believe, remained unrecognised. By the very fact of its conception, the board signalled that British Jews were not, after all, just like other British citizens, but the British Jewry did possess, and was obliged to possess, at least some of the characteristics of a state within a state. To this extent, the emancipation was compromised in the interests of communal safety. Thus, in a matter which possessed much irony, the establishment of the Trades Advisory Council was recognition of the enduring sense of Jewish separatism in Britain. To this extent, the outlook of the established leadership came to have something in common with those of the Zionists. Jews in Britain could never exercise the same freedoms which the British state alleged was the birthright of all its citizens. And we should not be surprised, I think, that the first General Secretary of the Trades Advisory Council was a Poale Zion activist, Maurice Orbach. I do not propose to consider here in any detail, nor do I have time, some consequential impacts of the policies and postures I have been considering this evening, but they cannot be ignored. In one direction, as I have examined elsewhere, these led naturally to an extremely narrow view of British Jewry's duty towards refugees from Nazi Germany and later Austria and Czechoslovakia. Anglo Jewry admitted the smallest number of Jews that it could, and the Jews that it campaigned to admit were in general Jews whom it thought could be easily assimilable into English society and who could be, quote, trusted, unquote, in order to engage in a set of business or industrial practices of which it approved. In another direction, the self-deprecatory postures and policies I've been considering played into the hands of the Communist Party, which became a safe haven, so to speak, for those British Jews who opposed the official communal line propounded by the Board of Deputies and its allies. And so began what the late Bartlett Litvinov termed the Anglo-Jewish infatuation with communism. But it must also be noted that in East London, communist fortunes also benefited from the increasingly corrupt and dictatorial rule of Maury Davis, both as president of the Federation of Synagogues and as Labour leader of Stepney Borough Council. From about 1928, Davis, the smooth-talking, Yiddish-speaking communal leader and racketeer, practically ran Stepney politics in alliance with the equally corrupt leaders of its Irish community. A jagged thorn in the side of the Lasky-led Board of Deputies, Davis's escapades were all the more embarrassing because his dependence upon the Irish led him to compromise over the fascist menace. In fact, Davis and 3 other Jewish members of Stepney Borough Council voted in order to allow the BUF to use Stepney Town Hall for the 1937 local elections. His removal through imprisonment at the end of 1944, that's Davis's removal through imprisonment, was therefore welcomed. But in the short term, it dealt a blow to the image of Labour, which was nonetheless severe while it lasted, and local communists reaped a predictable harvest. Ladies and gentlemen, the events that I've been considering took place a long time ago. The analysis is mine, but the chronology and the historical sources on which they are based belong to us all. The Board of Deputies neither misunderstood nor underestimated the threat that domestic fascism posed to the Jewish communities of the British Isles. To counter this threat, it deployed a number of strategies, all of which were proactive and carefully weighed, whether you like them or not. Those who made policy at the board were not dimwits. Complementing the public image of propaganda, not always under the board's own imprimatur, incidentally, to counter fascist accusations, they mounted a private campaign that included the clandestine investigation of the sources of BUF funds and the recruitment of spies within fascist organisations. In his use of paid agents, Neville Lasky was particularly discerning. In 1934, for example, he declined to employ the services of Mosley's deputy, Forgan, on the very sensible grounds that Forgan could not be trusted. Forgan, in July 1934, had a secret meeting with Neville Lasky and said, and Forgan was an ex-member of the Independent Labour Party, and said, I know Mosley is going to adopt anti-Semitism as an official BUF policy, which he did in October. I don't agree with anti-Semitism, but I will remain his deputy if you pay me to spy on Mosley. And we have a record of that meeting in the YIVO archives in New York. But Lasky, very wisely in my view, declined this. Well, who could he trust such a man as Forgan? Incidentally, Forgan, after this, went back to being a general practitioner. He was a medical doctor, and then made a very bad career decision by setting up practice in Golders Green. All this is true, but it is also true that the board's overriding concern was to command and control how Jews behaved and how they interacted with the Gentile majority amongst whom they dwelt. With some, but not many notable exceptions, the board at this time that we've been considering this evening believed that Jews, by their presence and by their activities, caused the prejudice from which they suffered. In pronouncing thus, the board was indeed defending the indefensible. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Geoffrey, for a lecture that was lucid and learned and not a little provocative. We have time for questions and comments from the floor. Yes, sir.
Just a question. Was it not also the fact that Mosley had a mass rally at Olympia? I forget the date. I think was it 38? When, as a reaction to left-wing demonstrators and hecklers, the brutal reaction.
They were smashed up, yeah.
The brutal reaction of Mosley's fascists led to a rapid decline of their popularity.
Yes, I think that rally was turning point, certainly so far as the Northcliffe and Rothermere press was concerned. But much more important for the Rothermere press was the fact that there was an unofficial but extremely effective Jewish boycott of advertising in Rothermere-owned newspapers. That boycott worked, and Rothermere then pulled his support from Mosley and wrote a leader in which he said Mosley and his works, he always knew they were damnable, and he was on the right side. But you're absolutely right. There were newsreels of that rally showing the so-called Biff boys of the BUF smashing up, literally smashing up protesters.
Yes, I was very interested in your comments about how the behavior of Jewish shopkeepers and landlords and employers contributed to anti-Semitic sentiment. And similar comments have been made by scholars about the behavior of Roman Catholics and Irish. My question is how, as historians, we can argue that stereotypes have some basis in observable behavior without falling into the trap of blaming the victim.
I have tried to be very careful not to blame the victim here. But I was brought up in the German empirical tradition of Leopold von Ranke. You tell the past wie es eigentlich gewesen, as it actually happened. I cannot ignore the evidence. And the evidence is that the charges made by the BUF and their fellow travellers against Jewish tradesmen were true. Of course, you could equally have made these charges against non-Jewish traders. Don't think that only Jewish shopkeepers ignored or tried to get round the Sunday trading laws, because they did not. But the question you're asking is a very sensitive one, and I suppose it is. In supporting BUF allegations, as I've done this evening, am I using my imprimatur, for better or worse, to justify, to legitimate the BUF? Well, of course, I'm not. I hope that's clear. I'm just telling the story. I'm not I've never claimed to be an intellectual, David. I'm just an academic. I'm telling the story as it was. After I finished writing this lecture and I was reading Bill Williams' book on Manchester and the reception of Jews from Central Europe, I was fascinated that Bill has dug out records that show that in Manchester, old man Nathan Lasky, the head of the Lasky clan, used his very palatial home residence, his own home in Manchester, as a private arbitration court where he personally heard cases brought by non-Jewish customers, tradespeople against Jews. It's a remarkable document that Bill Williams has discovered. Whether you may like the Lasky clan's reaction, you may not like it, but they thought at the time it was the right strategy to pursue.
You, sir, and then you, and then you, and then we'll go up the other side of the room.
Yes, 3 short points. Is it material that the pilot of the Aliens Act, the Aliens Bill in 1905, was Balfour?
He was the Prime Minister.
I think he was, then he may have been.
He was.
He piloted it, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, is it material?
Yes, the answer is
Thank
yes.
you. Is it material that you spoke to the only meeting of the Anti-Nazi League in Barnet, whilst refusing 3 times to join the Anti-Nazi League, as you said at the time to me, in order to appear on the same platform as Phil Paratin, the former Communist MP for Mile End? And lastly, perhaps someone might concern themselves with the Jewish Association for Business Ethics. I used to be a member of it, I think the only trade union member. I noticed that I could never get a discussion on the moral duty, legal duty, of a Jewish employer to recognise an independent trade union. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I hope, is it David?
It is
Yeah.
David.
How are you? Yeah.
I'm all right.
Gesundheit, be well. I mean, on the first point, Balfour was indeed the Prime Minister. Balfour was an anti-Semite. He did not, but a gentle Gentile anti-Semite. He did not want Jews to be in Britain, but he didn't mind them being in Palestine or elsewhere. So it is. It is. It is. But you know, we could spend the whole evening talking about Balfour and his brother Gerald. They were both Christian mystics, and so on and so on. On your third point, which was yes, the business ethics. You know, I hear what you say. I'm not surprised at what you say, but I hear what you say. We I think, you know, handed down from our Bubbas and Zadas, we have a very prismed view of sort of Jewish working class solidarity. But we know from research, not by me, about Leeds, that there was class warfare between Jewish trade unionists and Jewish employers, and by the late Dr. Joseph Buckman. And it's a pity that we haven't had some similar research in London. That there are in the records of the Defence Department Committee of the Board of Deputies some very sensitive but fascinating documents about the anti-trade union proclivities of Jewish employers in the East End of London in the time, David, that we've been talking about. On your middle point about the Anti-Nazi League and Phil Paratin, your memory may be better than mine because I'm in my anecdotage now. I never had any objection to appearing on a platform with Phil Paratin. Phil Paratin, incidentally, was the last Jewish Communist MP elected for a much depleted Stepney constituency in 1945. David, I remember Phil Paratin coming to my house because I wanted to interview him, and he was, of course, still a paid-up member of the CP, but he came in an absolutely brand new Rover car. You know, it's these little things that. But why shouldn't a member of the CP, I thought to myself, have a brand new Rover car after all? But I'm not sure. Let me defend myself. I'm not sure that I was never a member of the Anti-Nazi League. I certainly spoke at several of its meetings. I can remember one with the late Miriam Carlin, bless her.
You refused to join, with respect, and I asked you 3 times as the rotating chairman of the Hendon and Golders Green branch.
Did I give any reason for this?
Well, you probably didn't want to get barracked by Phil Paratin's relative, Mr. Kaplan.
No, I'll have to look back in my archives. I'll have to look back in my archives and see why. Yeah, there might have been a good reason why, but I can't think of it offhand.
Yeah, I wonder if you could comment on how much these are purely British phenomenon, especially the necessity for businessmen to look at their practices, these sort of things, because you certainly find that also in the literature on Germany and the United States in the same period.
Yeah, I apologise to you for the fact that my remarks this evening may have been severely insular. Of course, they weren't. as you say, they were espoused by the Jewish communal leaders in Germany, in the USA, in Australia. The same anti-immigrant, by which I mean anti-Jewish refugee policy that was pursued by the Anglo-Jewish gentry here in the 1930s was pursued by the Australian Jewish gentry in the 1930s, and for exactly the same reasons. So this was not, thank you for giving me the opportunity to make that point. This was certainly not restricted to this country.
In 1939, I was a 10-year-old pupil at Haygate Street Jewish School. We had several hundred students. My recollection, given that I was 10 years old, a long time ago, is when we were evacuated, we were split in two. Half of us went to Devonshire, I don't know where the other half went. Several hundred pupils. My recollection is that there was one German Jewish kid who'd been evacuated, or came to the school and got evacuated with us. Just one out of seemed like hundreds. Can you enlarge a little more, Dr. Alderman, on the British Jewish attitude to the German Jewish refugees at that time?
Anglo Jewry was very frightened about the prospect of large numbers of foreign-speaking Jews coming into this country. The communal leadership, with literally one or two exceptions, accepted fully Neville Lasky's diagnosis that Jews, by their presence, caused anti-Semitism. The policy was to recommend to His Majesty's government that the smallest number of Jews from Germany and after the Anschluss from Austria and then Czechoslovakia be admitted, and that that those who were admitted were, as I've said, very easily assimilable into British society. This record is not a very edifying one. If you read my review of Anthony Grenville's book on the German and Austrian Jewish refugees, as told through the pages of the Association of Jewish Refugees, my review just published in the Jewish Journal of Sociology, I actually go into this matter in some detail. There was an infamous incident at the Hendon United Synagogue during the Second World War, when the then president of the synagogue, Sol Cohen, having come up against many brick walls, not only for the rather well-to-do Jewry of Hendon accepting Jewish refugees, particularly children, into their homes, but even collecting money, he got up at the annual general meeting and made an impassioned denunciation at Riley Close in Hendon of his fellow Jews, and collapsed and died of a heart attack during the course of that speech. It was a very dramatic, extremely dramatic moment. The Hendon Synagogue had been approached by German Jewish refugees in northwest London to permit them occasionally to hold a Shabbat service, of course, in German, right? And the Board of Management refused on the grounds they didn't want German spoken at all, you see. And Sol Cohen was so upset and distraught that he berated at the annual general meeting his own community and collapsed and died at that meeting of a heart attack. It was not a very, ladies and gentlemen, it was not a very edifying record. It is shameful. It is shameful.
I must apologise. I missed out one gentleman here, and then you, sir.
Yeah, I've read your piece in the JC on the Cable Street, Battle of Cable Street.
Yeah.
You ignore the effect it had on Jewish population in England, and London especially, that they'd actually taken on the fascists, that they hadn't just laid down and let them do whatever they want to do. I mean, that must have been a very important factor for self-confidence. Also, to relate the growth of the BUF to that incident, to that happening, seems to ignore that we were in the depths of a depression, that fascist parties throughout the world were growing quite rapidly at that time and started to decline, I believe, when people became more and more disappointed or unhappy with what they saw was happening in Germany. The BUF membership rose and then fell with the way we perceived the German experience. Do you agree with any of that, or is that all?
No, I don't agree with any of that.
Okay.
The fact, ladies and gentlemen, that it made Jews feel good, maybe it did. But it also led to a rise in BUF membership. It permitted the BUF, don't take my word for this, you can read the black shirt. It permitted the BUF to say, we wanted to exercise our rights under Magna Carta, if indeed, David, it was under Magna Carta. I don't think Cable Street itself isn't mentioned in Magna Carta. We wanted to exercise our rights of peaceful demonstration, which was legal at that time, and the Jews suppressed our right. Now, it may well have made Jews feel better, feel united. But, and may I make a second point to you? The Jews did not do battle with the fascists at Cable Street. They did battle with the police. Now, I do not have to tell this audience how animal-friendly minded the English are. And the sight of marbles and other implements being thrown under police horses did not go down very well with the British population at large. Now, you can say to me, Geoffrey, OK, but we had to do it. There it was. I stick to the facts. The facts are that as far as we can tell, the most accurate estimates are that BUF membership peaked in the middle of 1938. The events in Czechoslovakia, Munich and so on, and a whole host of other factors led to its decline. And you can tell me, you can say, well, Geoffrey, 40,000, that's not a very large membership, and it wasn't. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, it was heavily concentrated in one or two areas. Now, of course, history is the study of what did happen, not what might have happened. So none of us can speculate. What might have happened had there been a general election in 1940? We know that Mosley said, I'm going to stand. We know from BUF records that the BUF was going to put up other candidates. But what would have happened, we don't know. What we do know at the time is that, and you don't have to take my word for it, read Tom Linehan's book, is that the BUF was very, very sophisticated in exploiting what happened at Cable Street. The spectre of a lawful march, a lawful protest, being suppressed by a Jewish communist alliance did not go down very well in the hearts of English homes. That's my view.
Just a small point. In your you made passing reference to Morris Orbach in your closing remarks. Could you remind us of the context? I didn't quite pick it up.
The context, you mean of Morris Orbach becoming the first General Secretary of the Trades Advisory Council? I see. Yes. The Trades Advisory Council was floated off the board as a nominally separate organisation in 1940 to intervene in disputes between Jewish traders and non-Jewish traders. But if you look at its records, what it was actually doing was putting pressure on Jewish traders and, incidentally, to go back to a previous question, Jewish employers to ameliorate, to change their business practices or employment practices in order to dampen down anti-Jewish prejudice. And what I said in my remarks was that I thought it was significant that the first General Secretary of the Trades Advisory Council was a Prolate Zionist, a member of the Zionist Socialist Party. Of course, Maurice Orbach, if you want me to speak about Maurice Orbach's later career, he became MP for East Willesden. He was, but as a Zionist, he cleverly and explicitly exploited the Jewish vote in East Willesden in 1945, but he refused to condemn for better or worse, the Palestine policy of the Attlee government, the Attlee Labour government after the Second World War, and eventually a coalition of anti-Maurice Orbach Jewish groups manipulated the Jewish vote in East Willesden to turf him out of the constituency. But that's another story.
Thank you.
You said that Jewish people could not get nationalization between 1924 and 1929.
Very few.
And what was the reason?
Because the Home Secretary was William Joynson Hicks, Viscount Brentford, and he took the view that only Jews who had demonstrated their abandonment of a Jewish identity within a larger British identity were worthy of naturalisation. He was quite explicit about this.
And how did they demonstrate it?
By giving up their Jewish practices, by sending their children to English schools and not Jewish schools, certainly not by being Zionists. And he made it absolutely explicit on the floor of the House of Commons, read it in Hansard, that when he was challenged on the small number of Jewish aliens, many of whom had, of course, come in before the First World War, on the small number that he was permitting to naturalise, he was absolutely upfront about it. He said, he didn't actually use the words of Norman Tebbit, the cricket test, but it was almost like that. And therefore, a lot of Jews could not be naturalised during this period, 1924 to 29, and because they were not naturalised, they fell foul in London of the LCC housing regulation and also the LCC scholarships policy, and also the LCC employment policy, which had been pushed forward by the Municipal Reform Party, which was a Conservative party, which controlled the London County Council from 1907 until the Labour takeover of the London County Council in 1934. Joynson Hicks, Viscount Brentford.
Yes.
With his top hat.
Yes. Yes, the result of that policy of not allowing naturalisation also had the effect those Jews who were treated as enemy aliens in 1940 were interned with the German and Austrian Jews then. Yeah. What was the board's attitude to internment?
It was very good. The board welcomed it. For two reasons. Firstly, now let's be clear about this. You know, the Chalif was at the throat. Adolf Hitler was using his high-powered binoculars to view the Straits of Dover, to view the White Cliffs of Dover. Churchill had the policy collar the lot, and you can bet your second best Strymel that the Board of Deputies of British Jews was not going to challenge that. But there was a second reason. The board, once war broke out, the board was extremely sensitive to the accusation that the Nazis had infiltrated spies and agents provocateurs within the Jewish exodus to this country. There were one or two cases where this was true. And therefore, from the board's point of view, to have all these alien Jews locked up was a machaya. Incidentally, the board also wanted Jewish communists locked up. This was a double machaya. The people who had ignored the board at Cable Street were being locked up. And there are cases in the archives of the Board of Deputies of course, once they had the lot had been collared, they were sifted out and a lot were released. Well, in the case of every Jew whom the security authorities had vetted and said this is a completely harmless person, you can let them out, the board was consulted. And there are instances on record in the archives of the board of Jews and Jewesses whom the security authorities vetted and say there's a perfectly harmless person, and the board said, no, keep them in prison. And so they were.
That's the paucity of numbers that came in Jewish refugees at that time.
Yes.
That was another reason.
But as the questioners pointed out, because so few Jews could become naturalised between the two world wars, a large number of Jews who had come in before 1914, such as my paternal grandfather, who came in 1904, were never naturalised. Now, my own paternal grandfather was not interned in 1940, but many in that category were. And in some cases, these were communists whom the board said, no, keep them on the Isle of Man or wherever.
Well, I think it's an appropriately sombre note for us to conclude on. But before we do go, I would like to thank you, Geoffrey, for answering the questions with a great deal of thought and generosity, but also for giving us such a very stimulating lecture. And I think we'd all like to thank you very much indeed.